So this PowerPoint is going to talk about kind of a technology within a technology, and that is the importance of videotape to television. As I've said, television is really a technology that was introduced to a society, to a world really, and has changed that world. Well, television wouldn't have become as influential and as omnipresent as it is without videotape. But to understand how videotape works, really, first we have to, and its effects, really have to look at how TV programs were aired in the early days of television. The first way was recorded on film. That is much the same way that movies were filmed and have been filmed really since their inception. And that is you set up the actors, you set up the scene, you place, if you are shooting with one camera, you set that camera in one place, the actors go through their dialogue or the action takes place, and then you take that camera and you move it somewhere else, and then the actors repeat their dialogue in that scene, and that's how you do, that's how you make movies. Or if you have a multi-camera production, you may have two cameras where those actors are doing their dialogue, and then instead of having the actors repeat it, you just have it all recorded on two different cameras. And then it is processed, the film is processed, it's edited, and then the final product is, the program is presented like films on film. The second way to do television programs in the early days was live. We don't have a lot of live programs nowadays. In fact, networks, when they do live programs, make a very big deal out of it, simply because it does take a lot of coordination. It takes a lot of rehearsal to make sure that all the actors are in the right spots and the cameras are in the right spots to capture that. What they would do is, most of these live programs were performed in theaters, basically the proscenium theater with the stage and then seats for the audience to watch. Again, this is difficult to do, and once it's live and it's done, it's done. There is no recording of it. What that means is that there is a problem with time, what's known as time shifting. That is that the United States is broken down, like the world is broken down, into time zones around the world. If it is 8 o'clock on the East Coast, where the television programs are originating for a prime time audience, that means it is only 5 o'clock on the West Coast. And that means that there isn't a prime time audience, because most people are in their cars or on the buses or on some sort of municipal transportation coming home from work. So there isn't an audience. So for programs that are performed live, that means that either they don't show that program on the West Coast, or they have to re-perform that program at 11 o'clock when there is a new audience on the West Coast, or they have to find a way to record that program so that it can be re-aired on the West Coast at a more cost-effective time, with a prime time audience. The method of recording those programs is the third way the programs aired, and this is what was known as the kinescope. Basically, you have a film camera that is attached to a television monitor, and as the program is being aired on that monitor, it is being filmed by the film camera. that film is then processed and then re-racked and shown at 11 o'clock on the network on the East Coast, so that those people on the West Coast can watch it during prime time hours. The problem with kinescopes is that the quality of the picture was just terrible. There were no real definitive lines. It was just kind of bland. The colors, there was no sharpness to the picture. The problem also, and this becomes a historic problem, is that a lot of programs of early television were recorded on kinescope, and the type of film that they were recorded on was a much a relatively unstable type of film called nitrate film. Nitrate film, if you don't keep it in an enclosed area with proper humidity and proper temperature, it starts to deteriorate. And unfortunately, a number of television shows that aired in the late 1940s and early 50s, there are no real records of them, or there are no those programs have been lost simply because the film that they were recorded on has deteriorated to the extent that it can't be recovered. So the kinescope was, even though it was a temporary quick fix type of technology, it wasn't a good choice. This, of course, led those in television to try and find a better way of recording programs so that they could maintain quality and still fix that time shifting problem. So how does videotape work? What video technicians were looking for was a model that was similar to the way audio tape works. Audio tape is made up of long strips of plastic. Now it's plastic that has an adhesive on it and has little metal particles. And when those particles are run across a record head, a specific pattern, those particles are put into a specific pattern representing the sound that's being recorded. So what happens with an audio tape record, first the tape is run across what's called an erase head. What the erase head does is really take those metal particles and just shift them around into a random pattern so that there is really no sound other than a kind of a hiss that's on that tape. Then the tape runs across the record head. And what the record head does is just what I said. It takes those particles and puts them in a specific pattern that is coming in from the sound. And so that pattern basically represents the sound that is being recorded. And then immediately after that is the playback head, which reads that pattern that those particles have been manipulated into, and that generates the sound that goes out the recorder into an amplifier and then into the speakers. Well, as a bit of audio tape is running across these heads, all of that takes about 2 seconds. Most audio tape runs across heads at about 2 inches per second, something like that. So this was the model that video technicians were looking at as a way to develop audio or video tape and record videotape. The problem was that video has a lot more elements to it, has a lot more data to it. Not only do you have audio, but you also have video. And that video is made up of a bunch of dots that are color, have different colors to them, there's also motion. And so those dots don't just stay in a static form, they change constantly over and over and over again, and many times in several seconds. So what they determined was that in order for this to be the model for videotape, what would have to happen is that videotape would have to run across these heads at a blistering pace of 25 feet per second. That just wasn't going to work. It just was untenable. So instead of running the tape at a very fast speed, what they came up with is turning the heads at a very fast speed. So what happens is, and this is these are called drums. The heads are all along the side of the drum here, the video head drum. This drum turns at a very rapid speed, anywhere from about 1,700 revolutions per minute. The tape is run along the heads like this and onto a take-up reel, from the output reel to the take-up reel. And so even though the tape is moving at about 1 to 2 inches per second, the heads are moving so fast that it can read all of that data that's on those heads and generate the image that needs to be generated. The first company to really do this successfully is a German company called Ampex. They came up with the first record playback machine in 1956. What they came up with is a very big machine that, of course, this is some of this is solid state, some of this is the Audion tubes, the vacuum tubes that we've talked about before. The tape itself was 2 inches wide. The reels were very big. So you had the input reel here that had the tape on it. The tape was run across the heads down here, and then you had a take-up reel over here. You had a monitor to look at the image to see that it was stable, and then you had controls down here to manipulate things like the color or the contrast, these kinds of things. The next big change came in 1969 from Sony, and this was the U-matic system. The U-mat had several changes to it. First, it was instead of 2 inches wide, it was only 3/4 of an inch wide, so it was a much smaller tape. The other thing is, and these are the really important characteristics, is that it was in a self-contained cassette, just like the audio tape cassettes. This was about 8 inches by 6 inches. In the front here was a little door that, as you put it in the opening here in the videotape machine, that door would open up. The tape was then pulled out and it was threaded across the heads. And so that was the second important thing, that it was self-threading. You didn't have to draw the tape across the heads from one reel to the next. The machine did all of that for you. So you just take the video cassette tape, you put it in the machine, the tape is pulled out, it runs across the heads, you press the record button, record whatever you want, rewind it, replay it, it's ready to go. When you're done, eject it, and it threads back into the cassette, and it's there for storage or to be used over again whenever you need it. So this was, again, a terrific change in convenience. for videotape, and really led to a lot of changes related to the portability of videotape. Even though the cassette format of videotape with the U-matic system was a nice change, more changes were coming. In 1975, Sony produced an even smaller tape known as Betamax. Betamax was, instead of 3/4 inch, now the tape itself was even smaller. That meant that even that the cassette itself was much smaller. But now what we have going on is another format war. The competition was between Beta, made by Sony, and VHS, made by Panasonic. The question was, where was each of these? This was the next format war, the next competition. Where was each of these going to end up in this format war? The result of the format war was that each really found its own niche. Beta had a much higher quality picture, which meant that it ran across the heads a little bit slower. It could take more data, but that also meant that you couldn't put as much on a beta tape. A beta tape would only record up to 4 hours. On the other hand, the VHS had a little less quality, had a little lower quality in its picture, but it could record 2 more hours of video. So basically, because of its higher quality picture, Beta wound up as the professional standard as far as TV stations and recording, professional recording programs. Whereas VHS became the consumer, the consumer product. Consumers could record more on it. They could record 3 movies on it, as opposed to only 2 movies on a beta. And so each really kind of found its own place, and that's where they went. But the development in videotape continued as digital became more and more prolific, more and more pronounced in the market. Sony came up with its first videotape, digital videotape, in the D1. It was very similar as far as size to the 3/4 inch U-matic tape. It was about 3/4 of an inch. It was a little bit big, not quite an inch, but a little bit less than, or a little bit more than 3/4 of an inch. And it also was, it was a digital format, meaning that the signal was processed. It was basically made a little bit better. The images were improved because it was being refined, and it was being manipulated so that the signal itself, and eventually the picture, the image, was going to be much more detailed and a little sharper. The next step, of course, was just to take that from its larger size and make it even smaller. In 1996, this became really kind of the standard for television stations, the high quality of digital, but now the smaller size, making it much more portable and much more easier to use. For Panasonic, they had their version of what was called DVC Pro. For Sony, it was a DV Cam. And again, these are about the size of a small audio cassette tape. And consequently, they were much easier to use, to carry around. You can carry a lot of them in a small container. And again, even more so was the mini DV. This was about the size of a couple of postage stamps. And again, the idea here was that you're taking the signal And much like we talked about with audio, with compressing the signal, you're taking out the data that isn't necessary, so that you're making the signal smaller. Therefore, you can put the signal, you can put the data on a much smaller bit of tape, and that you could have less tape to still have a good quality image. With digital video and specifically mini DV video, what this did was make really high quality professional videotape available to consumers. VHS and Beta had their problems in that you had what was called loss of generations. If you made a copy of a videotape and you made a copy of the copy and a copy of the copy, you would lose the quality very quickly. With this new digital type of video, that wasn't the case. Consequently, you didn't really have to work for a professional television organization or a professional documentary organization to really make professional quality, at least technically professional quality videos. And this really was one of the major factors in the popularity of things like YouTube. You could, as a videographer, you could make your own programs, and they had good quality to them. They looked very as if they were professionally made, given your skills. So this was really kind of helped or contributed to the explosion of video in really in the consumer markets. Certainly, videotape has its advantages. First, it's small and portable. As I said, as we go through the different types, the different formats, the cassettes themselves get smaller and smaller, and yet the picture quality gets better and better. So you don't have the large 3/4 inch tapes that you're carrying around. Rather, you have small wallet size, or even smaller than that size of tapes that you can use in your video shooting. The other thing is that it's compatible with television. Videotape shoots video at 30 frames per second, just like television. So once you have shot something, you can just take the tape, put it in the player, push the play button, and it automatically just plays on the television. You don't have to go through any processing. You don't have to go through any sort of developing or anything like that. You can take it out, put it in, push the button, and it's there. It also adds to editing flexibility. Prior to the videotape, of course, was film. Film meant that you had to process that film, and then you had to take the film itself and physically cut it and glue the pieces together that you wanted. With videotape, you had two machines. You had a play tape and you had a record tape. The record tape is where you were putting your edited version, and so you were doing things electronically. And these machines eventually became smaller and smaller as the tapes became smaller and smaller. And now, to the extent that we're not even using videotape, we're shooting video directly into computer files, and now video is being edited on computer. So even nowadays, the bulky machines are no longer needed. Rather, you can do all your work on a laptop. Videotape is also very durable. Again, about the only thing that is going to hurt videotape is time. Yes, videotape can be damaged. Sometimes it can be bunched up in the replay machine, what's called a wrinkle, and then you get a little line through the video. But videotape can be used over and over and over and over and over again. Really, the only thing that's going to wear it down is time. Eventually, that binder that's on there with the magnetic heads, eventually that will wear out, and the heads can, or the particles can collect on one of the heads, and you have what's called a head clog, and so you have to clean that off. But the reason that the particles have accumulated like that is simply because the binder has aged and worn out with time. So time is really the only thing that outside of actual physical damage that will hurt videotape. It's also the fact that videotape is cheaper. For TV stations, as they are going through, as they are keeping track of the changes in technology, early TV stations had to, if they wanted to record something, they had to record it on film. With film, you have, once you use the film, it's done. You can't use it again. And if you shoot a lot of film, you may throw away a lot of film because you don't need it, you don't want it. With videotape, you don't have to keep buying film. Once you buy the videotape, you can use it over and over and over again. The other problem with film is that you have to process that film. Once the film is exposed in the camera, now you have to take it and do what's called putting it through the soup. You have to put it through the fixer. You have to put it through the developer. It has to be dried. So you have to have the facilities to do that. Plus, you have to have somebody who knows how to do it, and that costs money. With videotape, all of that is gone. Like I said, you put the tape in the camera, you shoot video, you take it out of the camera, you put it in the player, push the button, and it's there. You don't have all of that other processing required by film. Consequently, you're saving money. Along with advantages, there are going to be effects, and they're going to have their place in television programming, in television news, but also how consumers use them, and really a dependence of the television industry on videotape. And we'll talk about each of those. As far as programming is concerned, the time shifting problem, the idea of having a program air live on the East Coast and not being able to run it live on the West Coast, now you have something that's going to be recording that program, and it can be played during a prime time on the West Coast, and again with an established audience, much like it did on the East Coast. So you no longer need kinescopes. The second effect is the impact on syndication and the growth of syndication with videotape. Syndication is taking those programs that have been popular in prime time, that have had their run in prime time. They may have been on the air for 3 or 4 or 5 years, maybe 20 years. Eventually they lose their audience. They're taken off prime time and then basically just put on a shelf. But of course, you've got for networks, they have these programs that are just sitting there. How can we use them to make more money? Well, what syndication does is provide for a station to have exclusive rights to running that program in a specific market. So how do you get those programs to the individual stations? You record them on videotape, and then you send out those recordings each week to the individual stations, and then they run the programs, and then return the tapes and get more tapes of those programs for the next week. Videotape made this just basically, this was how television was run. As more and more stations stay on the air longer, they need programming to fill that time. And syndication videotape helped this syndication expand and become more and more prominent in television. The next effect is in news. Certainly, no place has been more affected by videotape than news. First, it made news gathering much faster. Again, when we talked about film was being used by news organizations and television stations as their method of shooting video and showing that video during newscasts. Again, film has to go through a process. You have to get back to the station before a newscast, an hour or 2 hours beforehand, to get the film into the processor so that it can be cut up and edited into the video news story that the reporters are showing. With videotape, you don't have to do that. You don't have to worry about that. So reporters can stay in the field longer, gather more information, and then turn it around much more quickly. The second thing is videotape is much more cost effective. With videotape, you have you make a changeover from film. You make an initial large expense, but then it starts paying for itself very quickly. With film, you have to keep buying film, more and more film, because you can't reuse it. With film, you have the processing that has to be done to the film. You have the cost of all of that. With videotape, you don't have all of that. Consequently, once you make the big investment in video gear and videotape, then it starts paying for itself very quickly. And videotape is really longer lasting. As I talked about before, videotape, if it's kept in proper conditions, can last for decades. Whereas film, if it's not kept in proper conditions, can start deteriorating right away. The film itself the images themselves start fading. Eventually, the film could start to deteriorate also, even though we don't have the nitrate film nowadays that was prevalent in the early days of film. And what this means is that good quality video is available, even though it may have been shot 10 years ago. That video is still available in relatively good quality. As far as consumers are concerned, there are significant changes. First, it changed the way we watch TV and watch movies. Previous to videotape and video recording machines, if you wanted to watch a particular television show, you had to be in front of the television show that night at that time. Now you didn't have to. You could just set your recording machine. It would record the program for you, and then you could watch it at your leisure. Not only could you do that with one program, you could do that with lots of programs. It was also the fact that if you didn't see a movie in a theater before the film studio, took it off the market, it might be available in a video store. Stores like Blockbuster, now most of them are all gone, but they did Blockbuster businesses in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s because people would rent 3 or 4 movies for a weekend and then bring them back on Monday morning. Videotape was so popular for movies that pretty much any place that was a business could and would rent you movies. All you had to do was just sign a card to be a member, pay the $3 for the weekend that you would take the movie out and bring it back. And I mean, gas stations and convenience stores were renting movies out to consumers. So it really changed the way we watched television and watched movies. Before videotape, there was actually 8mm film where, as a consumer, you could take your film camera, you can shoot whatever event you are wanting to preserve, take the film to a drugstore or a film store. They send it out to a processor. Brings it back to the store. They call you. You come pick it up. Again, takes about 2 weeks to do something like that. Not the case with videotape and video cameras. You put the tape in the camera, record what you want, take it out of the camera, put it in a player, push a button, boom, there it is. So it really changed the way we record the events in our personal lives. And again, like I said before, this actually led to contributing to social media. The idea that you didn't have to, you could have instant video. You didn't have to have it processed by somebody else. And with things like YouTube, you could put it out there for anyone to view. Probably the biggest effect that videotape had was the dependence of the industry, of the television industry on videotape. I mentioned before that this is the technology within the technology. Television most likely would not be as omniscient as it is today without videotape, because it was videotape, the recording of programs in a quality manner for replay that made television available to so many different publics, not only in the United States, but around the world, such that if all the videotape in the world dissolved tomorrow, the television industry would stop. This is mitigated a little bit nowadays with the advent of digital recordings, of computer file recordings, but videotape is still used extensively in replaying of programming. The TV industry is so dependent on it for its programming. The only things done nowadays that are live are really news shows and any kind of live news event or live sports event. Otherwise, everything is recorded and replayed in some manner. And even though digital technology has made significant advances over the last decade, videotape still has its place. And so the industry continues to be dependent on videotape in many ways. The next technology change is the sending of communication television signals via satellites as opposed to television antennas terrestrially or through telephone lines. So direct broadcast satellites is basically having the same programming that's coming from cable or being broadcast through the airwaves, but instead of delivering through those other two, it's being sent up to a satellite from the ground, and then that satellite spreads it out over the United States, over a large region of the United States through the air, through a delivery system. It's kind of a combination of broadcasting and cable in that it's going through the air, but there is a requirement for having an encoder and a decoder at either end. Two things happen to make the satellite technology more commercially viable. The Japanese, who had been involved in innovative communication technology really since the 1960s, came up with a new signal that was strong enough that you didn't need a large dish to capture enough data to still make a good quality picture. And they did this really out of necessity. Japan is a very highly populated area in a very small space, and so people really didn't have big spaces to put in big dishes. So the dish that they came up with in 1978 was only 18 inches big, meaning you could put it on your apartment roof or your apartment balcony or the side of your the side of your small house, and still get the quality image from the satellite feed. And you didn't have to wire a community now. Each individual consumer could determine whether he or she or each family could determine whether or not they wanted satellite technology and programming on their own. The second thing that happened is that technology moved to the United States. It started primarily with cable companies thinking that this might be something that they want to get into, and services, dish or satellite services started with cable companies that had established themselves, but eventually satellite networks broke off onto become their own companies. This is a subscription service that, again, you can order up if you want to. By around the year 2000, there were 10 million subscribers, and only about 10 years later, that had tripled into more than 30 million subscribers. And again, really where it became the most popular is in rural areas where cable companies are just not going to spend the money to install wiring over miles and miles of roads and other areas only for 4 or 5 customers in a 10 or 20 mile square area. It's just not cost effective for them to do that. So what does a rural consumer do? It's much better for them, or they find it more cost effective to subscribe to a dish or a satellite service. The next significant development in television technology really is where we are today. And this is the development and installation of digital television around the country, also known as DTV. And there were 2 events that eventually led to this. The first is turning television signals into digital signals. That is, converting them into binary code, the language that computers use. That is ones and zeros and what are known as binary words, groups of ones and zeros that represent specific signals. What digital television does, or what binary code allows for, is taking the electromagnetic spectrum and expanding it, taking small parts of it, particularly the television spectrum, and dividing them up into even smaller parts. What this does then is allow where there was only one channel, taking that channel and cutting it up into even smaller parts and allowing more signals. So a signal that is really the channel for WEAU here in Eau Claire, channel 13, instead of having just the one channel, channel 13, now it can be divided up into 4 different channels. 13.1 is the primary channel for WEAU, but then they have now they're up to, I think, 13.5. They have 4 more channels. This, of course, makes that space available for them to have more programming, but also have more advertising, and of course the revenue that comes from that advertising. The second advancement is the increase of the number of lines of resolution for standard television from 525 lines to 1100 lines. Even though there are 1100 lines, we only see 1080 lines per frame. What this did, of course, is increase the level of resolution. Again, if you've ever used any still photography, you know that the more lines that you have, the sharper the image is going to be. And so what Japanese technicians did was increase, basically double the number of lines per frame of resolution, making the images much sharper for television signals. This eventually leads to high definition TV or HD TV. And again, simply because there are more pixels on the screen and lines of resolution. And this, of course, is going to lead to a much sharper image. And consequently, televisions can be much bigger and still keep good resolution. But what you need to understand is the difference between digital television and high definition television, and there is a difference. Digital television is required in order to have HD TV. You cannot have HD TV without digital television. The opposite is not true. You do not have to have HD TV in order to have digital television. That's why, as we'll see later, nowadays all of the TV stations in the United States are digital television, DTV, but not all of them are high definition television. So there is a difference between the two. What the FCC eventually does is two things. First, it helps create an international grand alliance that is within the United States and with other countries like Japan and Korea, broadcasters, researchers, electronics manufacturers, companies get together to really kind of decide what this new technology is going to be, what kind of standards are there going to be related to this new digital television. So again, it's an effort for standardization of the four elements that need to be present for a audio or video medium to become successful. The standards that come out of the Grand Alliance decision-making process are accepted by the FCC in 1996, and this is what becomes known as DTV here in the United States. The second thing that the FCC does is create a timeline for U.S. television stations, U.S. television companies to convert over to this digital television signal. In order to do this, what the FCC does is assign each station an additional channel. The reason they do this is because as a TV station, you can't just decide you're going to install some equipment, push the button, and bang, off it goes. You have to buy the equipment, you have to install the equipment, you have to test it to make sure that it's working properly and up to the required standards that are now accepted by the FCC. And then once all of those standards are met, then you use that signal to go on air, and that becomes your primary signal. And so each station needs an additional channel in order to do testing while its other channel is on air, putting on air programming and advertising so that the station can continue to make revenue. Stations need to do all this work and all this testing because the FCC has determined that by the year 2006, all stations have to have in place this new digital signal. because in 2009, they're basically all analog broadcast signals are going to go off the air. All stations must convert to the new digital signals on February 17 in 2009. Well, this is the idea. This is the plan, but of course, all plans have their problems, and most plans don't come to their final result, final planned result anyway. Um, what begins to happen is there is a recognition that one big group has been kind of left out of this whole thing, and that is the viewers. Even though TV stations are going through the testing, the changing, the installation, consumers still really don't understand what's going to be happening. What had happened up to this point is that Congress had set aside a whole bunch of money for consumers to be a part of this changeover also. What happens when a TV signal is changed from analog to digital? That means that you have to have a digital television in your home, in the consumer's homes, in order to capture that new digital signal. Almost all TV sets to this point have been analog. So with the majority of TV viewers, consumers in the country with analog television sets, that means they're not going to get these new digital signals that are coming out from TV stations. So the idea was that in order to ease the burden and not require viewers to go out and buy new television sets, what they could do is get a coupon, a $40 coupon that they could take to their technology store and use that to buy a converter. The converter would be plugged into the back of your TV set, and then it would capture that digital signal and then convert it into an analog signal that your TV could then use to show the images. So Congress allocates nearly $500 million for these coupons that people can write in and receive, have sent back to them so that they can use this money towards buying converters that they can attach to their television sets to convert the digital signal to analog. But eventually they find out this wasn't enough money. There were actually more television sets, more consumers wanting these converters than there was enough money for. So what had to be done is the FCC had to move back the date for the switch from analog to digital. More money was allocated by Congress, but also a more rigorous education was instigated as well. More public service announcements telling the audience that this was going to be happening. If you wanted to continue to watch your favorite programs, you had to make sure that you have and you have an analog television. You have to make sure you have a converter to change that signal. This was also a time when high definition was beginning to become popular, and so more and more people were actually just doing the switch when they bought high definition televisions. An education program was put into full force. More coupons were available. Another reason the switch was delayed is that there were some TV stations that were having trouble doing the conversion. Primarily, these were the smaller market TV stations and most particularly public television stations. Public television stations get their money from donations. And this kind of technology is very expensive, and they don't really have the capital investments to put into a switch over like this. So many of them were having trouble getting money enough to make this kind of technical switchover. Um, on June 12th, 2009, the actual switch comes. So we are now since 2009, 11 years now, have been all of the TV stations in the country are now on digital television signals. Like I said, this doesn't mean that they're all high definition, but they are all now sending out digital TV signals. So technologically, that's really well where we are today. What's going to happen next is really hard to determine because there are so many different factors involved. Um, viewers types of viewers have changed. The technology just keeps advancing every year, such that like we say, you can watch television on your cell phone, but then regular conventional television is also changing. There are fewer people watching television over the air and more people watching television over the internet. Younger generations prefer to watch television at their convenience and watch specific programs when they want to watch them. Television itself is changing, and really where it goes is really hard to say.